Welcome back to the Pastor Talk podcast. It is a pleasure to have you joining us for another one of these conversations as we reflect on 2020, a little bit of what that experience has been like, and we seek to look at that through a faith perspective to see what we might learn, how it might transform our imaginations, and how it might call us forward as people of faith. And today, I've got to confess, I think our topic today is a little squishy. I think it's a little hard for me to pin down exactly the through line. We chose the word perspectives. And what we have in mind there is this idea that in this time we've seen the world turn very heavily, lean into this idea of personal vantage. I think we've seen that in opinion. We've seen that in the places where we go to read, the communities that we go to have conversation. There's just been this hyper individualistic focus that's happened in this time, and perspective is an important sort of lens by which we can look at our world, and we can ask some questions about how we as people of faith should navigate. Is that fair, Clint?
Yeah, I think there's a sense in which this conversation is a little bit of a catch-all of things that you and I have had a lot of conversation about in the last 12 months, and trying to assign a label to them was not easy. And so this word perspective is one that we think sort of reaches into the various places that we will cover today, or the various places we'll visit today, as we talk about what it means to be people of faith. In other words, what do the people of Christ bring to some of our larger conversations? What changes when you undertake the kind of discussions that have been taking place in our world and in our culture when you enter them from a faith perspective? And one of the frustrations historically, and I'm not pointing this at anybody in the current world, but one of the places that the church has historically struggled is that when it has not separated itself with a different way of thinking and acting, in other words, when it has looked and acted like the world around it, it has historically not been a productive time for the church. It's been a time of struggle. The church is to stand out as different and other in the way that we have difficult conversations, in the way that we treat people we disagree with. We have a different mandate because of Jesus Christ. And when we have failed to do that, it has not been a productive time for us.
Yeah, I think that's a very helpful frame. In fact, as I have really engaged with people in this season, Clint, I think I have begun to feel more and more that one of the universal maladies of our time is that people fundamentally, at a very deep, substantial level, feel misunderstood. People don't feel like others listen or care about their life or experience. And so there's this kind of militant self-protection happening where we throw ourselves out into the world and say, here's my truth. Here's who I am. Please hear me, understand me, validate me. Well, whatever I'm doing, whatever I'm saying, whatever I'm thinking, I want other people to reflect back to me that I'm okay, that that's right, that's a good opinion. And it's good for us to try to engage with people in meaningful ways, but I feel like we've been doing that in a far more scattershot and not very thoughtful way. And Clint, to your point, I think as people of faith, we start from a very different starting place. Our starting block is that we will be misunderstood. Why? Because of the mystery of the gospel. The fact that we believe that this man, Jesus Christ, came, died, and rose again. That is, from its very starting place, a reorientation of the world that we should expect other people will not understand. So the Christian doesn't walk into the world thinking, I need everyone to know exactly why I believe what I believe. Now, Christians are thoughtful, faith-filled people. That doesn't mean that we turn off our minds or we don't engage in meaningful conversations with others. It means that we don't have an inner need for others to validate the truth of who Jesus Christ is. And that is a subtle, but I think game-changing difference between those who live in the faith and those who live outside the faith. I think this sense of being understood or not is something that we kind of leave at the door when we walk into this faith life.
Yeah, and we want to say on the front end, it is perfectly acceptable. In fact, I think it's even a positive that Christians would have strong opinions about things. I think it is perfectly fine for Christians to attach to ideas, to even be connected strongly to organizations or to political parties or to whatever. But what is not okay is when those things and the way that others in those circles act become normative or definitive for Christians. As Christians, those things are always secondary to the cross of Jesus Christ. How I vote, what I think about an issue, and in fact, because they're secondary, they should always be informed and affected by my faith in Christ. How I believe, how I follow Jesus should impact the ways in which those other things play out in my life. So if I disagree strongly with someone about an issue, that disagreement isn't the whole story because that disagreement stands under the gospel. And I know that in the gospel, I am called, I am compelled, I am commanded to treat that person as a beloved child of God. And therefore, even though I disagree with them, that mandate is going to set the framework of what that disagreement looks like. And we have in these moments, I think, Michael, and I don't want to sound judgmental here, but we have had no shortage of examples of Christians acting out in ways that, on the surface at least, do not seem to point back toward the origin of our faith.
Yeah, I don't want to sound overcritical. I certainly don't want to be judgmental. I include myself in this, but it has been disappointing to see as the church has in so many cases aligned with the opposing forces of our culture and times. Instead of finding more creative and under the gospel sort of orientations to those issues. And what I mean is that ultimately, in the moment in which we live, people have allowed themselves, and I think many Christians have allowed themselves to fall into the cultural sorting boxes of our time. Well, are you wearing a mask or not? Do you go to the Black Lives Matter rally or not? Do you watch this news network or not? Will you get that medicine or that treatment plan or not? The list is almost endless, and we have allowed ourselves, in some cases, to fall into some of these sorting mechanisms. And when that happens and it no longer stands under Christ, when we no longer allow Christian to define the rest, we do lose connection to our conversation partners. And this is where I think largely, as best as we could in this time, our First Presbyterian Church has done pretty well. Though even we would have to admit that we've had slippages in this time. It is the current is so strong to become hyper-focused on my tribe, on the things that we're rallied around, the things that we're afraid of. These are all topics we've had already. That in that place, those perspectives become normative as opposed to positions that we now stand under the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is the rich history of the faith that we not only inherit, but we on some level are responsible to continue. This idea that where we stand now must stand under, with humility, the grace, good news, and even judgment of Jesus Christ. And that's this vantage of faith that I think is substantially different than the one that we inherit from our culture.
And it hasn't been necessarily a cohesive argument, but over the last few weeks, we have looked at the trends through social media and through public conversation to kind of minimize things into simple ideas that are opposed to one another. And the opportunity for that, the opportunity for Christians in that is that the world, perhaps as much as ever, needs people who push back on that and say, no, I'm not going to be put in A or B, because there's this ground in the middle in which we talk to and learn from people we don't agree with. We seek out people with other experience so we can more fully understand the world in which we live and what our faith calls us to do and be in that world. It is a much more complex, it is a much more nuanced, it is a much more difficult way to seek a path forward. And the world needs Christians. The world needs people of faith who are willing to stand in those gaps and say, let's not demonize one another. Let's not just cast insults at one another. Let's not hold up whatever we agree with on our side. Let's talk about the whole of it. Let's get all of it on the table and see if we can find a way to value one another and move forward in productive ways in spite of our disagreements. And there's not, I'll only speak for myself. I do not see very much of that happening in the broader context of the world in which I live, and we desperately need it. And I think Christians are uniquely poised to help in that regard.
Yeah, let's not forget that Christians have navigated differences and nuance and perspectives from day one. If you went back and listened to our Faith Fights series, you're going to find some of those fights seem ancient. I mean, they seem lifeless. They seem like they don't even matter anymore. And yet some of those seem very current, and they're fraught, and they fill our cultural imagination. What's interesting, if you look at our history, we've always been people navigating different perspectives, different opinions, different understandings of the truth. And in many ways, the faith has showed us that Jesus Christ, by the power of the Spirit, is able to lead the church through those perspectives and with them, that the diversity and the nuance that is inherent in them is actually the tool that God uses to drive the church forward. We live in a moment in which we collectively seem to be afraid. We seem to be allergic of that kind of nuanced perspective. And I've got to be honest with you, the two words in sequence that I've heard so often in the year 2020, which to me has been incredibly disappointing, are the words, yes, but. Whenever a conversation happens and say, well, this person said this or they did this, that wasn't probably a good thing, or that wasn't very reflective of the faith, or that seemed like a factual falsehood, people say, yeah, but you'll never believe what the other people do, or yeah, but you haven't read this, or yeah, but this. And the but has been an out for all of us to say, well, if we flatten it to this or that, and you talk about something that may be slightly true, I'm going to discount it and completely dismiss it because of this other thing that I think is equal to or worse. And as Christians, we can't operate in the level of discourse and interpretation and discernment at that kind of binary level. The Spirit of God works in far more mysterious and connective ways than that. And so what I think we are tempted to do right now is to look at the things, the data that supports what we want to view, and then point to others as evidence that that is true. Whereas instead, our goal as Christians should always be to hear the voice of another, to discern in it the voice of God, and then to humbly allow that to transform our imagination and or inform our action. Maybe we hear another's perspective and say, I feel that my original understanding of it maybe was true, but it's going to drive me in the world to serve and love them in a new and more energized way. For Christians, we can't give in to yes, but kind of thinking. That's not the way that we do discernment and that we allow the Spirit to move us forward.
I think one of the temptations we've all struggled with in this period is to allow physical isolation to reinforce mental isolation. And what I mean by that is that in a time that we maybe weren't able to go out and do the things we wanted, that we didn't feel maybe necessarily the freedom or the ability to go out and pursue everything we'd like to do, we hunker down into our mental positions, and we do so with those who agree with us. So we get on Facebook and we gravitate toward the things that resonate with us, that we agree with. We do that in our news programming. We do that in our reading online. And as we've done that, we've built sort of isolation around ideas. That this is where I live mentally, and I'm not letting anyone else in. Nothing's going to change my mind. And as we do that, the result is we become closed. We become closed to new ideas, and to whatever extent that we may be not fully in step with truth, we become closed to new truth. And as Christians, this is important. We say that none of us have all the truth. All the truth is a property of God. All the truth is found in Jesus Christ. And so anytime I think my small quantity of it is true, all that is true for everyone, I have fallen into idolatry. I have fallen into the misconception that I am capable of something that is only found in Christ. And when we do that, we, again, make it so much more difficult to live out the gospel in a productive way, not only in our church, but in our society. And again, not to beat the drum too much, but society could use a picture of what it looks like to have a better system.
Yeah, and it's natural, and I think it just makes sense that while we are physically isolated, and we're tempted by that even mental isolation you speak of, Clint, that the conversation surrounding freedom is going to come up. The conversation about what are we free to do and not free to do. And man, you could track this you could write a timeline of the stages of this year based upon what part of the freedom conversation was active at the time. From can the government tell us to stay home to are we free or not free to wear masks? Are we free or not free to go gather in public spaces, in protest? This list goes on, and we could dial it in. What's interesting when you look at this from a Christian perspective, and I want to be clear that I do think Christians should have a sustained and substantive conversation about what it means to be citizens, what it means to have freedom from over restriction. Those are conversations that Christians can and should enter. But what I want to point out is I do think our vantage as followers of Jesus Christ transforms how we enter that conversation. Because Christians are convicted that as Christ came and gave himself for us, the very core of the gospel is that God takes on flesh, which is a going from perfection to a messy creation. And then God goes even further beyond that to take on death, to accept into God's own life the cessation of life, that in this movement from the heavenly heights even to burial, we see this movement where God gives up freedom for the creative sake of offering that freedom to others. In other words, Christians believe that freedom is never ultimately something that we're given to be freed from something, but rather that we see in God and Jesus Christ how freedom is a gift that we are given to someone else. So freedom moves us to responsibility. And that is, I think, a substantial reframing of these conversations that have been happening in the public sphere. Once again, I want to make it clear, those conversations are important, but the Christian, I think, has a higher level conversation of freedom to entertain. What are we as Christians going to do that leverages the freedom we've been given for the sake of our neighbor? How do we live as people who are responsible to love our neighbor as we've been called as followers of Jesus Christ? That's the way of the gospel. And those conversations, Clint, I think they have been happening, but they've been far muted in comparison to this larger cultural conversation surrounding freedom.
Yeah, I think societally we tend to think of freedom as a can I question. And biblically, freedom is often presented as a should I question. So Paul, for instance, when there are some people in a church who say, hey, there are some people here who don't eat meat because that meat may have been sacrificed to an idol. Should we or shouldn't we? Are we free to eat the meat? And Paul says, yeah, you can eat the meat, but that's not really the question. The question is, should you? And if you know that you're doing damage to your neighbor's conscience, then you shouldn't. You could, but you shouldn't. You are free to, but you are restrained by your relationship with others in Christ. And that also has to be considered as you answer the question. And when we flatten that question down to, can I? Can I do A, or can I do B, or can I do C, without asking the gospel question, should I? And understanding that answering that question is not about the thing itself, but about our relationship with other people. That's a much more difficult, that's a much more nuanced, that's a much more, frankly, important conversation. And for Christians to live in a world where just the volume of voices yelling, can I, can I, can I, and be able to step back and say, that's not an unimportant question. But for us, because of Jesus, it's also not the whole question. So we have to step back and think this through a little bit more before we join the side that is shouting whatever we think the best answer is. Interestingly enough, Paul goes on to say, I'm free to eat anything I want, but if I know it will hurt my brother or sister, I'll never eat it again. I mean, this is the nature. When Christians talk about freedom, we are talking about a concept with a depth and a complexity to it that is not present in the other discussion. And we don't get to just leave that behind because the world is talking about it this way. As Christians, we have to bring all of that with us to the conversation, and it's more difficult.
Well, it's absolutely more difficult, and it also requires a kind of honesty and introspection that I think is uniquely difficult in this time. And let me explain what I mean by that, because ultimately, I think it's a human temptation to assign ill motivation against another person, but to be gracious with our own motivation. And to say that more simply, we just give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. And when other people make a mistake, when they cut us off in traffic or they get caught doing a thing, we think, well, I'm glad you got caught because you were doing a bad thing. But if that was us, we'd say, man, I was late. I was trying to get to the thing, right? We can craft a narrative that gets us off the hook, and we're quick and easy, and in some cases, if we're honest, a little happy when other people get called to account for the things that they do wrong. And so ultimately, the motivation of our intention is actually a substantive issue in this moment. In other words, as Paul's reflecting upon which action to take, Paul looks not to the immediate implication of whether you should or shouldn't do the thing. What's the evidence related to what's right or wrong? In his case, are idols real? Paul says, no, idols aren't real. That's not the point. The point is, how are you motivated when you're seeking to make that choice? And ultimately, that calls us to question, are we looking outward as we're making decisions in our life? Are we reflecting upon how our exercise of our freedom, to use that language that we've been having in this sustained conversation, am I using that freedom for the sake of others, or am I using that freedom for a different cause? And that, I don't think, is a open shut solved it thing either, Clint. I think there is nuance, and sometimes the right decision as Christian may be to make that decision that benefits self or family or whatever it is. But we have to ask those questions. And we live in a moment in which that kind of nuanced, honest, challenging self-introspection, I think, has been hard for most of us to find.
Yeah, I think that can easily devolve into my own opinion, my own desire. What do I want to do? What is right, quote unquote, for me? And again, that's very natural, and it's not unimportant, but it's not the full picture for Christians. Christians have to bring a larger conversation that has to do with Jesus and others. We can never simply turn our focus inward and think that's the whole story, because Christ compels us to look outward and to consider our relationship, our impact, our example on those around us. And that is the opportunity that we have as we seek to live out the faith.
I laugh because, as we have conversations in the office, our conversations, if you've been following these podcasts or you join us for worship, you know that Clinton and I have a good rapport, but we do sometimes see things from different perspectives. And what I always value is when we come into a conversation and I make a statement, Clint will get this look in his eye like, okay, how did you get to that statement? And inevitably, there's going to be a pushback. And it's going to be, okay, can you really stand on that ground? Is that firm ground, Michael? Or are you just sort of making this up? And what I love about challenging conversations is there's sometimes when I realize I've been pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, and ultimately I realized, yeah, I was standing on the cloud. That wasn't a really firm foundation. I had an opinion about a thing, and you know what? I like my opinion better than your opinion, but ultimately it's an opinion. And I've learned that the real benefit of being challenged by someone who really asks, yeah, but is that firm? Is that true? Is that a fact? Really, if you see it from this perspective, would you still believe that? And if you're honest enough to say, man, maybe not. Maybe I stood on what I thought was firm and it wasn't. There's actually a freeing opportunity in that because it gives you the opportunity to land on, yeah, that's my opinion, and I think I just like that opinion, and I don't think it's hurt by having other perspectives. Or other times, and this has happened, you just have a moment when you say, yeah, I think I need to leave that behind. I don't think that's helpful anymore. When I see it from another vantage, that's a better way to understand the world. And I want to make this clear. This isn't some sort of philosophical how to navigate difficult oppositions. I think this is deeply embedded in the faith, that as we engage in Christian community, God has a way of letting the things that are erroneous fall and letting the things that are substantive and true rise. And that's historically how the church has dealt with very challenging differences of perspective. That we believe that God, who is the only truth with a capital T, will make truth rise in the life of the church. It's messy. It's often very hard, but we by faith trust that God is working the church towards that ultimate reflection, that closer reflection of what is true. And that has to happen in challenge and discourse and really at some level the humble recognition that our perspective isn't the perspective.
Yeah, I suspect I have been wrong more often in my life than I've been right. And in those instances, I look back with gratitude on the people who helped me see that, the people who in relationship. Now, they didn't argue me to a new position. They didn't, ridicule me to change my mind. What they did is they connected with me and they said, what about this? And oh, that's interesting. Here's what it looks like from my perspective. And in the midst of those exchanges and interactions, growth happens. And sometimes as growth happens, you find yourself saying, oh, well, my idea wasn't actually big enough. It may have been big enough for my life and what I thought I knew of the world, but it turns out it wasn't big enough for the actual reality that I now think I see more of. And as we do that, we should not be intimidated by that. That's what growth looks like. In order to live more fully into truth, we will always be called to let go of some falsehood. The only way forward is to, at some point, sacrifice the things that hold us back. That's true morally, it's true ethically, it's true philosophically, it's true intellectually. And as we grow, we should celebrate that, and that growth is a hard one. And when we dig in a place and just say, I'm not going to listen, I'm going to assume that anything that disagrees with my perspective is wrong, and therefore I can dismiss it. Or I can accuse those who have that perspective, that idea, of bad motivation. They're trying to trap me or trick me or do something I'm not. And when I do that, when I can find those mechanisms by which to just dismiss an idea without actually wrestling with it, without listening to it, without trying to understand it and be challenged by it, then I'm very likely not to grow. And if I have a good idea, that good idea will stand up to challenge. That's the nature of how things work. That's the history of growth in every segment of human life. But when I close myself off and say, I do not have to listen to you because you have a different idea, then I rob myself of the chance to have that growth in my life and frankly, in my faith.
And I want to be clear at this point in the conversation that it is natural when we think about perspectives to think about other people's perspectives. That's often the place where we do find conflict. That's where that rub happens, where people make us uncomfortable because of their perspective. Or we just see others and they're operating in the world as a possible threat to our own at its most extreme. I want to point out that our understanding, reception, and engagement with people of other perspectives is deeply shaped by our perspective of ourself, by the narrative that we spin around who we are as people in the world. And this is deeply connected. When we think of ourselves as the misunderstood hero, maybe even we, in some cases, think of ourselves as a victim, what we do is we shape the narrative in such a way that no one else could be right, that they don't understand my perspective and my struggles and my experience. And so therefore, whenever they say something, it's not true because they don't understand me. When we frame our perspective of ourself that way, it has a powerful way of reshaping our ability to engage with others' perspectives in meaningful ways. And Clint, that idea that you share about the fragility of our reality, the idea that if someone learned that thing about me, my entire life would come crashing down, that's not the kind of stability that people of faith should have. We should be firmly rooted in the confidence of the gift given to us. That's this whole idea around grace, the idea that we've been given something substantial that can't be taken from us. It's rooted in the truth of who God is. If we believe that, then we don't need to root our self-narrative in such a way that it devalues those who see things from a different vantage. In other words, just because someone sees the world differently doesn't make me a victim of their perspective. We have agency in Jesus Christ. In fact, I would argue we have the ultimate form of freedom to live a life that is wrapped up in the grace and giftings of Jesus Christ for the world. In our sacrifice and service, we're enjoying a kind of freedom that others don't have. And that's the very not intuitive reversal of the gospel, that in the service of others, in the motivation out of ourselves into the lives of others for the honest desire to serve and love them in the name of Jesus Christ, that kind of what may to the world seem like a giving up of freedom is a claiming of a new kind of freedom. And that is deeply rooted in how we view ourselves, the perspective we have about who we are as children of God. And sometimes, though it is very messy, dirty, difficult business, we need to return to that perspective and ask, is my understanding of who I've been created to be, is it one as a child of God, or have I allowed it to be shaped by different things?
It would be, I think the only word that applies is arrogance to imagine that I don't have within my collection of ideas and opinions some that are misguided, some that are wrong, some that are too directly tied to my own individual experience and not accurate in a broader sense. It would be crazy for any of us to claim that we had everything we think right and there were no exceptions. And so the Christian prayer really with humility ought to be, Lord, show me where I'm in error. Show me the places in which my life, both its practices and its conceptions, its ideas, aren't in line with Jesus Christ. Teach me that. And when we can start there, when we can start with that kind of humility that acknowledges, I know there are things in me that are not in keeping with who I'm called to be in Jesus Christ. I know that there are ideas I hold on to that are selfish and not therefore true in the idea that they reflect Jesus instead of me. And I need to be open to the possibility of being challenged in those areas. And as we do that, we refuse this worldly narrative that there's only ever A and B, as if we can care about vulnerable immigrants or we can have a safe country. We can care about the police or we can care about racism. Christians have to reject that kind of binary thinking. Christians can never settle for, okay, I guess I'll be on team A, and it's too bad we can't do anything about that. Christians have to be the people who say, no, it is possible to be compassionate and just. It is possible to be secure and aware of inequality. We have to be willing to see that there is more to the story than A versus B. And when we are able to do that, we find that not only do our ideas get shaped, but more importantly, we as people get shaped, and we have a better entrance to bring the light of the gospel into the world around us and how we talk to people. Imagine that the people who disagree so strongly on any issue, there's 100, you could pick any one you want. Imagine that you could have two people of completely different opinions on a subject, and they could sit down, and at the end, they could go, well, we may not agree, but I wish you well. I care about you. I'm glad and appreciate you sharing your opinion with me, and you've given me a lot to think about. And they could stay connected in a way that was bigger than their ideas. That's the cross of Jesus Christ. That's what we seek as we look to be faithful to him.
And it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to find ourselves in those circumstances where we, by definition, have to be a little vulnerable. We have to open ourselves up to the possibility, individually, personally, introspectively, that I might be wrong. And then, maybe even harder than that, we have to allow that possibility with another person as we engage in real conversation with them. This is messy, dirty, difficult business. And the reason why we can't fall into these binary traps of us and them is ultimately because those are ideas. And ideas, though they can be helpful in us navigating the world, God does not interact with us chiefly through ideas. The idea of incarnation, that Jesus Christ came as a person, is ultimately that God's love for us is relational. The mistake when we think that perspectives is all propositional, or to say that more simply, the idea that your perspective is only your opinion about the thing, is to devalue the person who is a loved child of God. And that's the mistake that we make in social media, or when we objectivize people on 2D screens on whatever news network we watch or whatever newspaper we read. Friends, ideas are good, and they help us as we seek to try to be more Christianly in our lives and in the world. But let us not misorder them, right? Perspectives only come from a person, and it is the person who is created in God's image. It's the person who we're called to love as our neighbor, and it's the person who we may identify as our enemy, yet that's the person we're called to pray for, right? So we can't think of perspectives, and we can't think of relating to other people who are different than us simply from this vantage of, well, I have to hear what they say. No. It requires us reframing them so that we see them as God sees them, as beloved, as children who were made in the image of the Almighty, right? And if we can let that reshape our perspective, then we find our ability to engage their perspectives very substantially changed.
So let's try, as we get toward the finish here, let's try to be practical for a moment and identify some of the red lights or some of the warning signs that we might encounter in our life when we're tempted to go down this road. In other words, as we exchange ideas, as we live in a world with our opinions and other opinions, what are the signs that we may be falling into these unhealthy patterns? And as we're aware of them, how do we react to them? So in other words, the first moment that we begin to insult people rather than listen to their ideas. So when we are doing a lot of name calling, when we're labeling, When we think that we can dismiss a person's idea if we can belittle or minimize them as a person, we should find ourselves thinking, oh, I must be challenged by that. Why am I defensive? Why am I angry? Why am I lashing out in this way? When we see that happening, that is never a sign of helpful kind of conversation. We get it modeled in front of us all the time in the media that we watch. It is a regular factor. It is a regular occurrence in our world. But when we participate in that as Christians, it should be a sign to us, I'm not on a helpful path here.
I think another I would add to that conversation would be when we start looking at our world through the lens of what we and what others deserve, we've now crossed into very dangerous territory. As Christians, ultimately, we believe that we've received what we did not deserve, that the grace of Jesus Christ grants us new life that we have no reason to believe that we should have expected or that we should have coming to us. And yet that's our temptation when we look at the world around us. We say, well, they deserve what they have coming to them, or I deserve better than this. I deserve to have this or that. And whenever we frame either us or them through that lens, we're beginning to stray from that core path of the gospel, that ultimately the grace of Jesus Christ reframes our lives from what we deserve to what we've been gifted that we're called to give to others.
I would add to that, Michael, you mentioned it earlier, motivation. When we listen to a person's ideas and we question their motivation so we don't have to deal with the idea, I think it is a warning signal. So when I say, well, my motivation is just the good of everybody and to do things well, but they don't really believe that. They're trying to get control, they're trying to take over, they're trying to do this, that, or the other thing. When I look past their idea and assign to them a negative motivation, it is very likely that I am not going to be able to engage in some sort of healthy and real relational moment with this person that I may disagree with. And I think that's a dangerous sign. I think we also see a lot of that, but we should not seek to minimize a person's idea by assuming that they're trying to do something, they're trying to lead us in some direction that is wrong from the start.
Another thing I would add would be we need to take honest self-assessments. And if we've not been challenged in substantial ways, then we are likely not on the path of growth. And this is really, really practical. The truth is, many of us have gotten to pick. We've had the privilege and freedom to pick what we like to read and the people we want to listen to. We get to pick who's in our Facebook groups, or we get to pick the newspaper, get to pick the TV channel. The list goes on and on. We have so many freedoms of who we engage with and who we give our time to. And if you do not read or encounter or have conversations with people that make you think, wait, is that true? Wait, what? I've not heard that before, or I can't believe that could possibly have played out that way. If you're not challenged and you find yourself always in moments in which people say things that largely encourage you and lead you down the path that you've always been on, I always become suspicious that we are walking a path away from the gospel, because a thing that has been consistent in my entire life of faith has been that when I have moments in which I encounter God, I'm like Peter. I end up trying to build a house when God just wants to have a moment of transformation. Because it's easier for me to do the stuff I want to do than for me to encounter a God who often has some challenging things that I need to be aware of and need to change. And so ultimately, if we are going through life and we are not being challenged, that would be a moment in which I would also begin to think that my ability to see others' perspectives is waning.
Yeah, and finally, and I realize that in an age of information, this is a tricky one, but Christians are to be people of truth in the capital T, meaning of God, but we are also called to pursue truth with a small t, meaning factual and correct information. When we participate in falsehood, even accidentally by shooting off emails and passing on Facebook stories that we haven't verified or that we haven't examined, when we don't stop to ask whether something is accurate, then we're participating in disinformation, which is not a helpful scenario. And the problem with this is culturally, with the internet, we have access to something that will say whatever we want. But when we hold that thing up and we're not really honest about, okay, this probably isn't the most reliable source, or where did I get this information? When we do that, we are not engaging in real conversation with people. We're simply picking facts that we like or things that we want to attribute as facts, and we're using those to further our opinion rather than be challenged by what may be a more accurate assessment that we get from somewhere else. So it matters that Christians deal in reality and factuality. We have to do that.
If you're made it this far in the conversation, you may think, oh my goodness, that is a weight. That's heavy. How in the world is that possible? And here I think we've now come to the crux of what we mean when we talk about our faith transforming our perspective. Because we don't believe that we can do it. That's the point. The point is we understand the gravity of how hard it is to live in this kind of vulnerable relationship with other people, that we might even dare to love our enemies. We cannot do it but by the power of the Holy Spirit. God working in us, transformation of the heart, salvation. This is what we as people of faith have been given. And this is what makes us different from the culture that surrounds us. We have nothing to protect because the gift that we have been given is given to us by the Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, Justifier of all. So ultimately, our trust and hope is in God, and it's God working this in us. So ultimately, while these are signs on the dashboard, the work that we seek to encourage is, rather than trying to do this all ourselves, is invite God prayerfully to do this within us, to call upon the God who is able to work through us unimaginably more than what we can imagine ourselves doing. And that's the truth and hope and good news of the gospel, is that yes, this is beyond our ability to do by ourselves. By the grace of God, we don't have to.
Yeah, and we hope, and probably should have said this on the front end, we hope that nobody feels criticized, that nobody feels kind of beat up by this. There have certainly been moments over the past year where Michael and I have been frustrated by broader conversations in some of these areas, and maybe some of that passion comes out in this presentation. But this isn't something that we're labeling others or trying to accuse anyone. This is a standard to which we all aspire. We are all led by the cross of Jesus Christ in front of us, and as we seek to be faithful, we have to wrestle with the reality that the patterns and what is normal in the world cannot be then applied to the church. We are of a different world. We are of a different substance. We have a different mandate and a different set of ideals and motivations and goals than does the world around us. Sometimes they overlap, but when they don't, we are called to fix our eyes on Christ and keep Him as our primary motivation.
So we speak of perspectives. We're glad that you've been with us, and we hope that as you've been part of this conversation with us, that maybe things that spurred you might be willing to share with us. You reach out by email, or maybe you make a post on YouTube or Facebook or wherever you're enjoying this conversation, or maybe you share it with someone else so that you might engage in conversation with them that's meaningful. But friends, ultimately, our hope is that by the grace of Jesus Christ, we might be connected with one another in new and more substantial ways, and that in that we might experience the goodness and love of God that has always been intended as people of faith.
Thanks for listening, guys.